The Chinese are able to produce high-quality electric vehicles that could be sold in Canada for something like 35 or 40,000 Canadian dollars, much less than most of the electric vehicles on the market now.
And the Prime Minister made a series of announcements today, among them delaying an EV mandate. It's an effort to help the auto sector, which has been turned around by American tariffs.
The story opens with a city that has seen this sort of noise before. In Washington, the late summer air feels thick with the sound of cameras and the echo of one more promise to make America great again. The president stands at the lectern describing a new round of tariffs on electric vehicles and parts. It sounds decisive, patriotic, almost cinematic, until you realize what it means for the towns that built their lives around the border economy. Across the Great Lakes in Ontario, entire shifts of auto workers are about to discover that a policy meant to punish China has landed on their own paychecks. In Ottawa, Mark Carney begins his morning with the same ritual he has kept since his central bank days: black coffee, a stack of briefing folders, and the quiet patience of a man who measures time in fiscal quarters rather than tweets. His advisors speak in low voices about the shock coming from Washington. The United States has just placed a 25% tariff on imported EVs, and because so much of Canada's industry feeds those assembly lines, the blow lands squarely north of the border. On Carney's desk sits another folder, this one stamped with a red Chinese seal. It contains an offer: funding, technology sharing, a partnership in green energy and battery production. What would once have seemed unthinkable now looks like insurance. Factories in Windsor and Oshawa begin to slow. Car parks fill with half-finished cars missing the parts held up at customs. Workers stand in the shadow of idled conveyor belts, trying to decide whether to laugh or curse. One of them says quietly that the managers told them to wait it out, that it was only politics, but each week the line grows slower. By the second month, shifts are canceled. The optimism that usually fills these industrial towns starts to fade. Carney watches the numbers coming in: exports dropping, suppliers nervous, provincial budgets tightening. For a generation, Canada has lived with the assumption that the U.S. market is its permanent home, its guarantee of stability. But the new reality is colder. The White House now speaks of allies and rivals in the same sentence. Dependence looks like weakness. Half a world away in Beijing, officials read the same headlines with quiet satisfaction. They offer trade credits for Canadian grain and beef, then invite a small team of Canadian engineers to tour a lithium plant in Sichuan. The message doesn't need to be spoken. If Washington wants confrontation, there are other doors to knock on. In Chinese newspapers, editorials appear with the careful optimism of a government that knows symbolism when it sees it. They call Canada a partner of modernization. The phrase is chosen precisely. It flatters without binding. At night, the lights burn late inside the Prime Minister's office. The debate among advisors is sharp: trust versus risk, loyalty versus strategy. Some warn that leaning toward China will bring retaliation. Others argue that a nation of Canada's size cannot afford pride. It must adapt or be left behind. Carney listens, then says evenly that fear cannot be a plan, that options are what keep small countries safe. The room falls silent. The remark will later circulate among journalists as the line that defined the new Canadian posture. The following weeks feel like a replay of an old film. Television screens show footage from the last great trade war: Trump waving executive orders, assembly lines closing, the rhetoric of sovereignty and protection. But this time, the collateral damage is hitting a neighbor, not a rival. Economists describe the costs in numbers too large to feel real: tens of thousands of Canadian jobs at risk, billions in exports lost, investment drying up. And still, the tariffs hold. In Toronto, a trade analyst sits before a camera and tries to explain the shift in simple terms. The problem, she says, is not just economics but trust. The U.S. has become unpredictable, and in markets that live on confidence, unpredictability is poison. China, she adds, offers consistency and cash. Two things business people understand. In Washington, the president remains unshaken. During a meeting with auto executives, he jokes that Canada will come crawling back. They always do. The room laughs politely, But the diplomats who have served long enough to remember NAFTA are already writing cables of warning. You cannot humiliate a partner and expect loyalty to survive, one memo says. Allies adapt. By midsummer, the anger on Canadian streets is visible. Workers march with placards that read, "Save our jobs," and "Tariffs are taxes." Local news captures interviews with families whose mortgages depend on overtime that no longer exists. A dealer in Windsor says he feels as though he's been mistaken for the enemy. "We built this industry with them," he says. "Now they treat us like China." In Beijing, the paperwork continues moving through the system. A memorandum of understanding is drafted, promising cooperation on electric vehicle batteries, lithium mining, and renewable infrastructure. For years, the United States had accused China of using trade to gain influence. Now the same strategy is winning over an American ally without a shot fired. When the Canadian delegation lands in Shanghai to attend an investment forum, the image is unmistakable. A Western democracy stepping onto the stage of the Asian century. A reporter calls out a question about whether this marks a pivot east. The envoy smiles, offers no answer, and keeps walking. Actions will speak. Back in Washington, the chatter at think tanks turns anxious. Panels with titles like "The Future of North American Integration" fill with analysts debating whether Canada's move is betrayal or common sense. One economist sums it up crisply: "Weaponize trade, and you teach your friends to find new suppliers." Statistics begin to confirm the shift. Within months, cross-border exports of auto components fall nearly 40%. Ontario's unemployment ticks upward. In the US, car prices rise. Chinese manufacturers, untouched by the new tariffs, grab market share across Europe and Africa. Even governors from industrial states start to plead for moderation, warning that the pain will not stay north of the border. The White House responds that it is necessary pain, patriotic pain, and the cameras roll. Then, on an overcast morning in Ottawa, Carney faces reporters and ends the suspense. Canada, he announces, has agreed to cooperate with China on green energy development and battery technology. It is, he says carefully, not a shift of allegiance but a diversification of partnerships. The room bursts into questions. Will this strain security ties? Is this the end of American friendship? Carney answers only that resilience requires choice. Dependence is not stability. It is risk. Within hours, the American president appears before his own press corps, visibly angry, declaring that Canada has stabbed the United States in the back. He warns of consequences and suggests that defense cooperation could be reviewed. Yet aides admit privately that the reaction masks surprise. No one in Washington believed Ottawa would actually accept Beijing's offer. In China, the response is almost serene. State media describe the agreement as a sign of mutual confidence. Commentators call it proof that cooperation beats coercion. The triumph is quiet but unmistakable. A Western nation has joined a Chinese initiative by its own decision. From the factory floors of Ontario to the policy rooms of Washington, a new awareness settles in. The world that once revolved around American decisions is beginning to tilt on its own axis. The lesson is uncomfortably simple. Pressure breeds alternatives. And as America pushes its allies to choose, some are choosing to move on. The shockwaves from Canada's announcement ripple instantly through the corridors of Washington. Think tank panels scramble to interpret it, cable networks replay the press conference on loop, and markets flutter with the anxiety of a long marriage suddenly under question. For decades, the US-Canada partnership was considered unshakable, the safe border in an unsafe world. Now, it feels like something foundational has cracked. In the Pentagon, national security analysts pore over supply chain maps. Their findings are alarming. Nearly 78% of the US military's advanced weaponry, from fighter jet turbines to missile guidance systems, relies on rare earth elements sourced or refined through networks that ultimately trace back to China. And many of those supply routes pass through Canadian ports and logistics hubs. By aligning with Beijing on critical minerals and green technology, Ottawa hasn't just shifted trade policy. It has touched the nerve of American defense dependency. Behind closed doors, Officials describe it as strategic vulnerability. They recall that rare earths, the metallic elements buried deep within the Earth's crust, are the invisible backbone of modern warfare. Without them, there are no radar systems, no smart missiles, no stealth capabilities. China, long aware of its dominance, has weaponized that knowledge before. Now, with a new deal pulling Canada into its orbit, Washington fears the supply chain could become a diplomatic minefield. Inside the White House, aides gather for an emergency briefing. The president slams a printed headline onto the table. Canada partners with China on rare earths. U.S. caught off guard. His advisors argue over strategy. Some urge him to reopen negotiations with Carney before the damage deepens. Others insist on doubling down, tariffs, sanctions, a show of strength. The political instinct is to never appear weak, but the economic reality is that America has walked itself into a corner. Meanwhile, in Ottawa, Carney maintains a calm exterior. The Canadian media paints him as both a pragmatist and a risk-taker, a man who has decided that playing neutral in a polarized world is the only path to survival. In an interview, he says softly, "We are not choosing sides. We are choosing the future." But everyone knows that in geopolitics, neutrality is never free. And so, as the cameras fade and the analysts move on to the next crisis, one reality lingers in the air. Canada has crossed a threshold it can't easily step back from. What began as a response to tariffs has become a declaration of independence, not in words, but in trade routes, supply chains, and quiet alliances. For the first time in generations, America looks north and no longer sees a mirror. It sees a nation making its own bets in a world that no longer revolves around Washington. And somewhere between ambition and necessity, the balance of power quietly shifts.